A few weeks ago, I made the big declaration that I am ditching 1x and converting all my personal bikes to 2x. For the most part, I've been pretty pleased and it's the right decision for me, but the transition wasn't completely smooth. So in this video, I'm going to talk about 3 kind of issues, problems, challenges I ran into and how to fix them. So if you want to ditch 1x yourself and go 2x, which is basically 2 1x's at the same time, that's what we're going to talk about in this video. And hey, if you guys appreciate that I talk about non-status quo bikes, I'm not going to tell you that an $1,800 group set is the group set of the people like some other channels. GCN. If you appreciate that, consider supporting the channel by joining us on Patreon. That keeps all this independent bike content coming. Or go to the merch store and pick up some stickers and patches. We still have tons of our unserious cyclist patches. The first big issue that you may run into is that lots of new bikes don't have the necessary braze-ons to support a front derailleur. So you kind of have to hack it yourself. Let's take a closer look here. So this is my Bear Claw that I put a double on, and this one actually has a cable stop. So lots of modern bikes no longer have this. This one is specific for a downward pull front derailleur. Some front derailleurs have the cable stop built in, but many of them don't. So this is the first issue that if you're making that transition, you may run into. I've switched bikes. This is my Crust Bambora. So to get around the lack of built-in cable stop, you just have to get a clamp-on one. This just goes around the seat tube and it provides a place for the hosing to stop and the cable to run upwards. These come in doubles and singles. For this application, you just need a single. Another thing you have to figure out is the diameter of this tube. So get some calipers. It's usually like 28.6 if it's like a, kind of road bike looking bike. But it could also be larger, like 31.2 or 4, I forget what the number is. Another issue that I ran into was simply derailleur choice. Which front derailleur do you use? This is less of an issue if you're running a standard chainring combination, 50-34, even 46-30. But if you're like me and you want to run a sub-compact crankset, it becomes a little bit trickier. So this crankset is by Rivendell. I believe it's a 3826. I'll put the specific numbers here. But basically, since it is a smaller crankset and it doesn't conform to kind of the diameter of a traditional road crankset, you'll see that the derailleur cage doesn't quite match the line of the big ring, or in this case, even the chain guard. In this situation, I've made do. This is just an old Shimano 8-speed. I think it's a road double, might be a road triple, and I'm using it with a friction shifter so I don't have to worry about indexing. But it's kind of an interesting mix. So this is an 8-speed front rear derailleur. It doesn't really matter. This is an 11-speed chain, and these are supposedly 9-speed chain rings. It all works together if you run things in friction. Show you guys really quickly. So works perfectly. One problem that you'll run, however, if you're using a sub-compact crankset and a front derailleur, is that if you use a road style front derailleur, it'll get really close to the chainstay. And the reason that is because I had to lower this just so that it would push the chain effectively. This is designed to be typically set up a little bit higher for those larger road chain rings, but it works okay in this situation. You can also see how this overlaps with the tire. In this specific situation, I don't get any tire rub with the front chain ring, but if this tire were any knobbier, that is something that could potentially happen. So this is the front derailleur in the inner ring position. You can see it still clears this and it still also clears the tire, but any knobbier, and there could be some unwanted interaction between the tire and front derailleur. The best solution to that, especially if you're running a sub-compact crankset, these rings right here are a 40-26, I believe. So a lot smaller than your typical road chain rings. If you use a mountain bike front derailleur, these conform a little bit better. One challenge, however, is since mountain biking has mostly gone 1x, these are a little bit harder to find. This front derailleur is made by Microshift. Rivendell sells them, and they're not very expensive. I think they're like 30 bucks. They're not the prettiest looking thing, and they're a little bit on the heavy side, but dang do they work good. A front derailleur like this solves a bunch of problems. The first one is you'll notice that there is a ton more clearance between the bottom of the front derailleur and the chainstay, whereas on the other bike it was pretty tight. Another advantage of a derailleur like this is since it doesn't protrude as far, it also has less of a likelihood to interfere with the rear tire. You can see there is oodles of room between the tire and the front derailleur, so I could probably run a much wider and knobbier tire here and still be okay. So if you can, try to run a front mountain bike derailleur. They're kind of hard to find, but they're still out there, or you can get this microshift one. One issue with most mountain bike front derailleurs is that they're usually sized for a larger diameter seat tube, so try to find it with the appropriate shims. This is shimming this one down to a 28.6. Another issue you might run into is to actually find shifting chain rings. Since the move to 1x, a lot of chain rings have a narrow, wide profile. And these, at least in theory, although some people have said that they can still shift with them, don't shift as well as chain rings designed specifically to work in a multiple chain ring configuration. There are some alternative chain rings you can get. I forget, this one is an Origin 8, and you'll notice it has several drillings. I think this was designed as a fixie track / a BMX chain ring. It's 3/32 spacing, so it works with your typical multi-gear chain. The important thing, at least here, is that it doesn't have a narrow, wide configuration, so it still shifts relatively well. Not too bad for a fixie BMX ring. Sorry for all the air quotes, by the way. The last problem I ran into, it's a little bit hard to illustrate, so you're gonna have to deal with my face making mouth sounds, unfortunately, is that I found with my DIY doubles, where I took a triple and turned it into a double, that when I shift between chain rings, that the chain would kind of fall into no man's land in the middle and get stuck. I saw very little documentation on this problem online, but I did hear references to using spacers to kind of shim the chainring over. The reason I think that this might be happening on this bike is that because I am using that BMX fixie ring, it wasn't machined, or it wasn't in machining, it wasn't dished to be part of a chainring system, but probably kind of more in line with the crank. To my head, I just had to nudge it a tiny bit closer to the second chainring. First thing I tried was going to a regular hardware store and looking for spacers that would fit. These didn't work so great. It got half of the kind of chain bolt combination to pass through, but I'd have to bore these out for it to work best. So I went to Uncle Jeff's website and picked up a bag of these. Yes, these are chainring spacers. Who knew this existed? Basically, they are the same thing, except the inner bore is larger, so all the bolts pass, and it's also just generally smaller, so it won't interfere in a negative way with the crank arms or the spider or whatever. On this crank set, I had to use 5 of them and move that outer chainring in just a smidge, and it worked great. It worked great. Who knew? Interestingly, I also found this problem to happen with this DIY crankset as well. This was originally a triple. I got rid of the middle ring, bought a slightly larger, smaller ring, and used the same outer ring. However, when shifting between the 2 rings, again, it would just fall in between. So I used those chainring spacers between the crank arm and the large ring, just moving this one over just, a smidge over. I think maybe a millimeter, and that's all it took, and it shifts great. So my transition from 1x to 2x has not been the smoothest. There have been, a couple of little obstacles to overcome. Do I regret that transition? No, actually, I'm pretty happy. I love the added range. Currently on my off-road touring bikes, if you will, I have an 11 to 40 cassette in the rear paired to a double. I could go even lower, put an 11 to 42, or I can make the inner rings even smaller. So for me, there's a lot of adjustability that you just don't get with 1x. The only thing you can do at that point is either get a smaller chainring, which then affects the entire range, or just get a bigger and bigger rear cassette and an even longer knuckle dragging rear derailleur. Hopefully this video was helpful. If you learned something today, found it educational, entertaining, please consider supporting the channel by joining us on Patreon or buying a sticker from the merch store. Gotta buy that merch, and as always, keep the supple side down.